Hi, you are watching an up-to-date program with me, Yulia Nechyporenko. Ukraine's household prices for gas are understated and it causes numerous problems, experts say. So, does Ukraine need market-based prices for gas and why? Let's ask Andriy Boytsun, Research Director of the Center for Economic Strategy. Hello and welcome to our studio.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
First of all, could you specify consequences of understated prices for gas and why do we have such situation?
Well, I think before discussing the consequences of the problem, I would like to outline the magnitude of the problem in the first place. So gas is a type of fuel that Ukrainian population is using more than others. It constitutes around 10% of Ukrainian imports. So wherever you have a huge deficit, a huge price difference, you should multiply that by the magnitude of the problem. To give you just one example, Naftogaz of Ukraine, Ukraine's largest company, is basically the mechanism through which the government is subsidizing, or has been in any case over the past years, the mechanism through which the government is subsidizing households. Their deficit was nearly 6% of the total government budget deficit in Ukraine. So just one company having that deficit is already a great illustration of the fact that this is a severe macro problem, not just a local thing. Now, why do we have those prices? Gas has typically been a commodity that the government, it has been a sensitive issue to increase the prices because it would affect the voters. So politicians have always been reluctant to increase prices, not to lose their popularity. Populism has been very big in Ukraine over the past years. So no politician with a short, let's call it political life. So if you get elected for 4 or 5 years, but the consequences of the reform will be felt later, you will always be reluctant to increase the price because it's going to fire back on you.
So mainly it's about political dimension as for the state-regulated prices in sense of voters and just to be loyal to social issues, let's say. And what about consequences? Could you just name them and then we'll just focus on details?
Indeed, it is about the political, it's mostly the political aspect that has affected this. Because the gas sector has been what is usually called a natural monopoly, it was easy for the government to control this. If you take a look at any other commodity, the government has no reason, but sometimes most of the time, no way of regulating the prices. Now, what are the consequences? Well, the first obvious consequences is the government budget deficit. The shocks that Ukraine experienced last year, for example, the heavy fluctuations of the exchange rate, have been the result of the deficits originating from the gas sector. That deficit is huge in the first place, and the government has to compensate for that deficit every other time. For example, in April, the statutory capital of Naftogaz of Ukraine was increased from around 50 billion hryvnia to around 160 billion hryvnia. So it was increased by more than 100 billion hryvnia. It's an enormous amount. It is something that comes from the government budget, which means that ultimately it comes from the taxpayers. So whenever anyone says that increased prices are going to affect the average Ukrainian, they have been affecting the average Ukrainian all this time, except that the average Ukrainian didn't know how.
Still, if we have such consequences, you mean for the and the influence on the taxpayers and on the state budget, hence, what is the mechanism of the raising the prices? Or what is it so difficult that the political tension could prevent?
It is not that, well, let's say you asked me what the consequences were, so I named you one.
One of them.
There are others, of course. Another consequence is that whenever you have a lowered price for gas, you do not create any incentive for the consumers to be energy efficient. Yeah, so Ukraine is, compared to other countries with similar climatic conditions, is probably the poorest user of energy. So we're spending energy. I think this example has been used many times. In the winter, when it's too hot, we would open the window in order to make it a little cooler. So energy efficiency is another example of how lower prices affect the Ukrainian economy. Yet another consequence is the corruption in the distribution of gas. You have different prices for households, and this is exactly where the political dimension comes in. So the politicians are willing to show how good they are towards the people in order to be popular. They have no need of demonstrating that to the industry, so the industry is paying the full price. But the local distribution companies have the incentive of buying the gas at lower prices, which is supposed to be sent to the population, but is actually forwarded for the uses of the industry. So you have corruption, which is also a vast problem in itself. Finally, you have a problem with own production of gas, because Ukraine has been typically importing gas from Russia. So most of the gas came from Russia, but Ukraine has also its own production. It has not been increasing because of this strange concept that the local gas, locally produced gas, should be used for local consumption, and therefore it should be sold at local prices. But the idea is that gas is just a commodity. So whether it's produced in Ukraine or in Russia or in Turkmenistan or wherever, it's just the same substance. So there is no reason for having different prices for the same substance, irrespective of where it was produced. So you have a number of areas where you feel the consequences. And the political dimension, to get back to your question, you may have noticed that the prices have been increased in one go by almost 4 times, by 267%.
Due to the aid package of the International Monetary Fund, actually,
yes,
pushed the prices up.
Right, but some of the reformers were saying we should do it gradually, but if you are to do it gradually, the natural question is, why have you not done this over the past 5 or 10 years, increasing the price slowly? So it was a political decision, and it was done under the pressure of the International Monetary Fund. Yes, that's true.
So you've mentioned all these consequences, and I'd like to come back to the domestic production of gas in Ukraine. What is the potential of Ukraine, and could Ukraine provide itself with the gas, maybe not now, but when? Then, because the Prime Minister once said that maybe 10 years it will be possible.
I don't think anyone can give you an exact number, but there is a clear consensus among the specialists that there is potential for increase in local production. That's true. But combined with energy efficiency measures. So if Ukrainians start using less gas for their purposes, for example, by investing in insulation of their houses, by regulating the temperature, by switching over to other sources of energy, they will also reduce the total consumption. So those two measures combined can lead to full energy independence of Ukraine. So this is more or less the consensus that we have today. But that does require some effort on the part of the government and every Ukrainian as well.
But just to this energy efficiency, it's a good expression, but it also means extra expenses for Ukrainians, right, to do that.
Right.
Should there be any programs from the state to support these expenses, because it's like an investment?
It is an investment, and I think that the government should be focused on the policy stimulating the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian household to invest in energy efficiency. You will obviously have a number of people who are not rich enough to invest in energy efficiency. That's a separate task for the government to provide a social cushion to give some social support to those people. But the middle class is well positioned to invest, and if it is given enough stimulus, for example, privileged loans or tax cuts or things like that. But that's the new role for the government. So what the government has been doing so far is simply selling gas at lower prices, incurring losses that had to be compensated through expenses from the state budget. And like we said, these are huge amounts of money, and these huge amounts of money could be used for investing in something that is sustainable. So you cannot achieve energy efficiency in one day. No, that will take a couple of years, but that will be money well spent rather than spent.
Understood. And moving forward to the corruption in this sphere, you mentioned that due to these understated prices, there is corruption component. But if to raise prices till the market level, is it the only tool that will eradicate corruption in gas sector?
No. It's not the only tool, and you're absolutely right. Sometimes we use metaphors from the medical sector to illustrate the idea, and so you cannot do surgery without an anesthetic, so to speak. So you need some compensatory measures in order to have this work. So if you increase prices, you will definitely have a certain percentage of people who will not be able to pay those prices. So a compensation for that, a compensatory measure for that would be a social policy supporting those poorer people. If you raise prices for the middle class who are in a position to pay those prices, you would have to encourage them by giving them incentives to invest in energy saving measures, for example. So you do need a number of measures that would support the reform. Increasing the prices themselves would be a failure, yeah, and would not be realistic either, I think.
And Ukraine is not the only country that is facing such problems, because countries from Eastern and Central Europe, they have passed this way in different ways with different results. And could you just define, or let's say describe the models in the country of Eastern and Central Europe which were successful, fulfilled, and which could be in Ukraine, which could be implemented in Ukraine?
Well, I'm now looking at the presentation that we put on our website. So in that there is also a note in Unfortunately, it's in Ukrainian only, but the executive summary is available in English. But the idea that we are suggesting is that most of the countries have followed very similar scenarios in reforming their energy sector. So first of all, they created a competitive environment, they created an independent regulator, they created transparent pricing, they did increase prices. They then created incentives for energy efficiency, and if we look at the international experience of similar countries, and by that I mean Central and Eastern Europe, you see that energy saving is often leads to a saving of 20 to 60% of gas, and then invested in social support. And if we look at various Central and Eastern European countries, we will see that those experiences differ. So we use two cases in our note, one from Poland and one from Moldova. And Poland has been a very successful example of reform. So they have done the steps that I have just described in a successful manner. But in Moldova, for example, what they did in Moldova is something that we call halfway measures. And those halfway measures, it's like having a surgery with not enough anesthetic. Mm-hmm. So it has not been done to the fullest extent, with the result that some of the objectives have been achieved, but their budget problem has not been solved, for example, and their state energy company is in a state of bankruptcy at the moment.
But speaking about Poland, you mean 1990s?
Yes, I mean 1990s. I mean they started reforming their energy sector in the early 1990s.
And if to compare with Ukraine and with these, windows of opportunities, and by the way, there are different conditions between Poland and Ukraine. What is different? What is difficult? What difficulties in Ukraine, which Poland, of course, didn't have then, except these hostilities and these expenses?
Right. Well, I think that issue is. The issue that you're raising goes beyond the gas sector. It pertains to the general momentum of the reform. So what Poland did, Poland had a very strong motivation, and it did use the window of opportunity in the 1990s. It did go through a painful, I'm not sure if you went to Poland in the early 1990s, I was there, it was much poorer than Ukraine at the time, but it did recover very quickly. Due to the painful measures, due to the surgeries, let's put it that way, that were done at the time, Poland had. On the one hand, I think the difference is that Poland had a shorter history of socialism, especially in the 1990s, no history of crony capitalism, which Ukraine has by now, and it did have a strong external pressure. There was a strong drive to join the European Union. So there are differences. I think Ukraine did not have that in 2004, for example, but it does have it in 2014. But yes, you are right that there are differences. For example, there are already vested interests. There is a post-Soviet history which will be difficult to break, yes, but I don't think, at least from international experience, we don't know any other way to reform the energy sector.
But the systematic approach it's a very important thing, and in this case, from your point of view, if just to sum up very briefly, does our state is working in unity? I mean, these structures are united in this sense, or we have just reformers who are trying to do that, but not together?
Well, I think the government, in terms of people, the government changed very much, and for the good thing. So I see a lot of people who are passionate about affecting the reform. I see a lot of people who know what to do, who are professionally much better educated people than before. more passionate people than before, more enthusiastic, more patriotic people than before. But I would not say that's, that they constitute 100% of the government, no. Outside that, of course, you have the interests outside the government. You have the business trying to influence the government. And unity is not the word that I would use to describe the approach by the Ukrainian government, but I think there is a potential to.
Thank you very much, and it will be really good to finish with this, that we have a potential and at least we should keep moving. Thank you very much for coming and for answering our question.
You're welcome.
Just to remind, our guest today was Andriy Boytsun, Research Director of the Center for Economic Strategy, and we talked about reforming of the gas sector in Ukraine. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Goodbye.